Hi, good morning or good afternoon, whenever you're watching this. This will be uploaded. Obviously, you now know because you're finding it. But we look forward to sharing this with you today. And then maybe we can have some brief discussions when I meet with you on Tuesday. Uh, the the thing that I want to mention before we get started and quote today's lecture, it seemed like you were really engaged. Last time, yesterday I guess it was, when we gave you a tour of both my lab and the Sperry lab, and you seemed very fascinated with certain aspects of the Sperry activities. So let me add this component. As you're putting together your proposal, which of course is due next time we meet, and by the way, we're going to make the due date not this Thursday, but Tuesday, because you may not necessarily be in class on Thursday, that you may want to do something with some of the archives that we have. All the times that we've been working on the Sperry projects since 1990 or so, we haven't had the opportunity to have access to Sperry materials. So if some aspect of your work involves working with the archives, let's include that, see if we can make that happen. All right? Let's pick up where we left off. As you might recall, we were discussing the history of the American Psychological Association. There are several things that you could have gleaned from it. First of all, that it was very, very diverse at the very beginning, and only essentially a couple of dozen people were really the ones that made it happen. And then it grew to, really big, almost 120,000. Also, the part that you should have gotten is white male. Now we have white female, white male academic, and now we have white female and clinical, probably with a small c rather than a big C. So it involves things like counseling, school, neuro, health, and so forth. The other thing I want to emphasize is the unique nature of APA having four major areas, which include academic, which is, let's call it teaching, and then there's a part called education specifically, and then there's another part called science, and then there's another part called professional practice, and then finally public interest. There are essentially four parts to APA, and the thing that's so important is that really represents the wide approach to psychology. Now, remember there's four, and then we subsequently can split that up into roughly 50 or 55. Like I said, we have humanistic, and we have this and that, and legal, and experimental analysis of behavior, experimental, and this shows this unusual proliferation of different ways to look at psychology. So one way to look at APA and one way to look at psychology, in fact I think a very viable and useful way, is to understand that there are four areas that are big: academic, so forth, as I told you, and then within that there's 50 or so. For example, we have neuropsychologists that only do clinical, others that only do research, others that only do teaching, and so forth. So keep in mind there's four, and within those four you can split it up into further. The other thing that I wanted to share with you regarding APA is the beauty and complexity of having 50 or so different voices. Imagine we have 50 people shouting at the same time what they think should be central to psychology. It becomes almost impossible. It's really tough to get some cohesiveness out of that. Imagine just this class, which doesn't have that many. If I ask you all to shout at the same time, what do you like most about psychology? We're going to have all kinds of different people shouting, and it's not going to make a heck of a lot of sense, because in reality, all I'm going to hear is like one voice or another. It's sort of like CNN these days. When they interview a whole bunch of people, they're all shouting. You can't even figure out who's talking, or for that matter, what they're saying. So with that comes the question is, if we have 50 or so voices of psychology, how is it that we make it into one cohesive one? So when we go to the world and explain to them, here's who we are, what do we do? And to that end, this year I've proceeded to basically begin a different journey within my foci within APA Focus. Within APA, as you know, I was the 125th president a year and a half or so ago, and now I'm taking over as co-chair of a newly developed concept called the Advocacy Coordinating Committee, which essentially tries to put all those 50 voices together into one unified. So when we go to Congress, when we go to National Science Foundation, when we go to National Education Association, whatever it is that we go to, we have one cohesive voice that represents the beauty and variety of what psychology is. It's been very difficult. We've been at it now. Literally, I guess this is our 5th week, so we got a long ways to go, but that's a goal. So I think that knowing the history of APA is interesting, in part because, well, this is the association has been around the longest, and it's the umbrella association that represents psychology, all of psychology. But I think if you understand how APA works, you could also understand how psychology is. This is a good paradigm to appreciate the world of psychology. So when we're talking about the history of psychology, we're talking about each of those areas, the 4 big ones and then the 50 different voices, and the concept of trying to unify it all as one rather than 50 voices. So stay tuned. Let's see what the rest of this semester brings us as far as how we make that megaphone work. How do we get 50 voices to have one? Well, we will see. So I'm curious. This is a big ask of the association and a big horizon to tackle. But if we do it successfully, it will add a lot to not only APA but to psychology. As you recall from the syllabus, which I think you have at this juncture, one of the things that we're going to also talk about is the history of other associations. And I'd like to just give you 2 tiny ones, and then maybe we could spend a little bit of time towards the end of our presentation today in discussing the history of psychology at UNCW. As far as the 2 associations I want to discuss 2 that reflect, in some ways, sort of the yin and the yang, the 2 major sides of psychology, which in some ways have been at odds and in some ways are really important. And that is one that's maybe a little bit more scientific and one that's a little bit more clinical. So let me take the National Academy of Neuropsychology as an example, because this is what's happened over the last few years is that APA has gotten so big, and as you have heard, there's so many different voices that it's become difficult for you to find your niche, if you will. So very often people say, well, APA is too big. It doesn't really speak for me. I'm really just this kind of psychologist. I'm an industrial psychologist that does structural equation modeling and trying to figure out how best to select personnel. Or alternatively, I'm a peace psychologist that believes that we should not have any wars, and psychology should be there to foster peace and humanity rather than deal with military. So as a consequence, let's get rid of the military within psychology. So when you hear those kind of really deep, profound voices say it's all about just that, what's happened is that people have begun to split off, and then they've chosen to band with people that think like them, in this case, neuropsychologists. So it's, well, I really don't care about peace psychology. I don't really care about military or drugs and behavior, or for that matter, group process. Those things are, I'm glad somebody's into it, but I'm not. I just want to do neuropsychology. So groups such as the behavioral therapy, pharmacology, and so forth, they've kind of split off and have their own little societies that just deal with that area. They're very myopic, just that subspecialty. In the case that I want to talk to you about, which is a good example and one that I'm familiar with because I was one of the founding fathers, if you will, I guess in these days, grandfather of the Societies of National Academy of Neuropsychology. We met in Orlando, Florida, where I'm headed today, That group was at that point probably 25, 40 of us, I don't remember. We met a World Hotel. It was a dump of a place. And we all were trying to figure out how is it that we could put together our ideas about just a psychology involving the brain and, for that matter, behavior. So that small group sort of started growing and growing, and it went from about 25 or 40 that were present at that first conference in Orlando to, I believe this year we'll be meeting in New Orleans, and that group will now represent somewhere in the vicinity of probably about 3,000, 4,000 psychologists, and the conference itself will probably about 1,000 or so people. So we went from 25, 40 people at that first conference to about 1,250 this year coming up, and 4,000 or so individuals. Our budget at the time was whatever we brought to the table. There were about 25 posters, if I recall correctly, and 2 or 3 presentations, and that was it. So there was really nothing to it. We've grown exponentially and become very powerful. Now, let me see if I can add this. So we have a bunch of these splinter specialty groups, like I said, behavioral therapy, pharmacology, so forth, so on. Now, how does this interface with the bigger APA? So we got, say, 3,000, 4,000 people that are into neuropsychology. They're part of the National Academy of Neuropsychology that was founded, by the way, I believe in 1980. And I think I was the 10th president or something like that. So we have that small group, and then we have the big group, like APA. How does that work? I know it sounds weird, but let me see if I can give you an analogy. It looks like this. I think of groups like NAN, the neuropsychology group, as the tail. And I think of APA as the dog. And sometimes APA is happy and the tail kind of wags. So we get good testing codes for neuropsychologists, get good reimbursement, and the tail wags. And then unfortunately the tail sometimes doesn't match the body. And there's things that don't work out. So, for example, some neuropsychologists believe that they really should be more focused on this, whatever this is. In this case, could be that we need the codes to be represented better by insurance companies, and that APA is too big on issues involving social justice. So they focus on getting more reimbursement for neuropsychological service. They focus more on the science of the brain, and then they tell APA, well, you need to do more of that. And sometimes some issues do go to the surface, like, for example, one big issue that's occurring right now is that the neuropsychologists have encouraged APA to focus on getting involved with, for example, Medicare, so there's better reimbursement. So when that happens, then the tail actually wags the dog. And this is how psychology has come to be these days. Essentially, we have sort of a big umbrella. What is all of psychology? And in many ways, that's what the history of psychology is. I'm not going to tell you about the history of neuropsychology only. I'm going to tell you about the history of all kinds of psychology. So the history of psychology is very much like APA. And when you take a course with me, for example, like brain and behavior or neuropsychology, then those courses are very, very narrow, only specifically focused on that. If you take a developmental course with Dr. Kishton, then he's going to tell you that's where it's at. If you take something with Dr. Pilgrim, she's going to say behavior is where it's at. If you take something with Dr. Nooner, she's going to say it's clinical. So, like all of us, we all have our specialties, but in reality, it's important to know that beyond our specialty is this umbrella association. And that is what psychology has become today. One psychology for all, and then individual specialties, which, as I shared with you earlier on, depending how you cut the pie, could be 50 or maybe even more than that. Now, what about the North Carolina Psychological Association? That's the association that reflects what's going on in our state. That association, I think, it's interesting in many ways because it reflects what's happened to psychology. And just to get it off the mark, I think I became president of that the year I was president, a year after I was president of the National Academy of Neuropsychology. So that's why I'm telling you about these two, because I'm obviously very familiar with them. NCPA was founded in 1947, right after the war. Unlike the specialty societies that have become more prevalent in recent years, like 1980, 1990, 2000, these state associations were founded in the early 1940s, 1950s. And the reason for that turned out to be very simple. APA was held in places like New York, Chicago, Los Angeles. Sometimes students just didn't have money to go to these big conventions. It was too far to go, and for that matter, needed the faculty. So the faculty decided that they needed a sort of a smaller venue that was accessible. So many institutions like Chapel Hill were very involved early on to try and make these small societies that would allow people to present their research findings. It would allow people from Chapel Hill to get together with folks, for example, with ECU and Appalachian State, because they're pretty far away. So most of the conferences were very small, very academic, and they were held almost always in the research triangle part, the central part, the heartbeat of our state. However, by 1960, 65, 70, as I've shared with you, there was a good, big old growth in the practice of psychology, and specifically in clinical psychology. As you recall, the VA needed a lot of psychologists, so we populated those positions in North Carolina, as I've shared with you. There are 4 VA hospitals. Once they were finished, then we populated the state psychiatric hospitals. I believe there were also like 3 or so. And once they were populated, the nearest one, by the way, is in Goldsboro, about an hour away from here. Once they were populated, then people started going to private practice. And they needed to have a place so they could meet. They also couldn't afford to go to Chicago or Los Angeles, and it's too far away, even New York. So this small association then became the home of where these private practitioners would go. And then these associations became the place where we began to have advocacy at the state level. For example, we didn't have licensing laws for psychologists until about mid-1960s or so, and it was the North Carolina Psych Association that decided to put that together. So they pushed that, and then all of a sudden you started seeing the conventions being primarily, or slowly I should say, these clinicians. So instead of having academic folks that brought in their students, it became clinicians. Now it turns out that if you want to present your scientific research, sometimes you present it at these state associations, but you tend to present it either APA or one of the specialty societies. So what has occurred is that NCPA, South Carolina, all these have been really the place where clinicians hang out. And if you go to these conferences like the ones we have coming up in the spring, which will give you extra credit if you want to go, I don't know where it is, I think maybe Charlotte. But anyway, if you go there, it's going to be a talk about, like I said earlier, codes for how to get reimbursed in testing. It could be one on psychotherapy with borderline patients, and you won't see a whole lot of workshops or talks about how to do statistics for complex problems or experimental procedures. That is really meant for the specialty societies and to a degree APA as well. So those groups have grown in a different perspective. They're not huge as a rule. I think North Carolina maybe over 1,000 members, and the conferences are usually a couple of hundred or thereabouts. But they're vibrant places. We happen to have an unusually good state association, And for many years we had a wonderful state executive director, Sally Cameron. She was actually the first person that was hired back in the 80s. Just to give you an idea, how it grew. We didn't have anybody running the show. We now actually have a building in Raleigh, north of Raleigh, that we were able to purchase with people's generous gifts several years ago. Very, very lucky to have been part of that back in around 1990. So these are really different ways to look at the way of the world of psychology. APA is the umbrella association, and we have sort of the scientific, maybe clinical group like the neuropsychology, and then we have the very clinical group like the state associations. The reason I give you these examples, partially because I'm very familiar with those. Those three I have been presidents of, but more importantly, this is a window to what psychology is today. In many ways, you want to sit back and ask the question, okay, if that's where we are today, how do we get there? And that's really what we're going to do starting very soon. I believe in the next week or so, we're going to stop this discussion of where we are today and those big old questions, what's psychology all about, how do we do it? All those questions are going to be put off to the side. We're going to start digging more into, okay, this is where we're at, how do we get here? But before we do that, let me take a few minutes this morning or afternoon, depending on when you're listening to our presentation today. I want to take a few moments to also tell you about the history of our university, just in broad strokes, in specific our department. We were founded, it's about the same time as NCPA, I believe, around 1947, as a technical college. It was Wilmington College, and it was basically put together by New Hanover County to try and retrain the young men that were coming back from the war that needed to find a place to work. And they had been in the war. So this is the first effort by the community, technically speaking, by New Hanover County, to make this happen. And this is basically set up in a small location across the street from New Hanover High School on Market Street. Next time you're on Market Street, headed to downtown, and you see the high school on the right-hand side, you'll cross, or you'll pass an overpass, and to the left of that, on the southern side of Market Street, is where Wilmington College was at. As a matter of fact, if you take a picture of the marker right in front of Roses, Coal, and Ice, and bring that to me one of these days, I'll give you 3 points, because you have now gone to the epicenter of where psychology started in New Hanover County. After a number of years, I believe in the mid-60s, we moved on to what we now have our campus. College Road was really non-existent. It was all pine trees, and several hundred acres, I wish I could remember the specific amount, was donated or sold to very, very little, I forget, but it was basically given to Wilmington College to set its sights on a bigger growth. And as you may know, there's 3 buildings that were put together. Those 3 buildings at the front. Let's see, Alderman is one of them. Do you remember the other one, Colby?
James.
Hinton James, yeah.
And...
yeah. Well, come to us. Well, several things.
Hoggart?
Hoggart, yeah. Hoggart was, I think, our first president. Hinton James was the first student that attended the University of North Carolina. He came from New Hanover County, and that's why the building was named after him. Those are the 3 little buildings, and everything occurred there. Now, if you want to know something fascinating that you probably don't want to know, I'll share with you. That is the scene, those 3 buildings, the scene for the backdrop for Cape Side High School, which is a high school that was central to Dawson's Creek. was one of the big series that was filmed here for many years, and very, very successful. This is how UNCW became what it is. So we went from Wilmington College to University of North Carolina, Wilmington, I believe in 1967, and that's when William Wagner became chancellor. He had been president, he became chancellor. We became part of the UNC system. We did not have a psychology department. In fact, we had basically a Department of Education at that point. And soon after that, they hired a couple of people, including our esteemed Michael Bradley, to start teaching developmental psychology courses. And that was done when the School of Education was started in King Hall, which is right beside the library. And we had a tiny little corner, I think it was the southwestern corner of the second floor. That's where the psych department got rolling. Our first chair for the psych department, which I believe was started in 1974, was a fellow who surprisingly came to us in a motorcycle, and he had long hair, and he basically was an animal behaviorist. John Williams was a character that was larger than life, and he established a department with some very young people, including Dr. Andy Jackson, who eventually became chair of the department. Mark Galizio has been a chair of the department. Rich Ogle, who is now in administration, and our current chair is Julian Keith. One thing that's curious is, at least from my angle, only one of those are clinicians, but all have been very active researchers and great instructors, which is actually something that's really central to our department. We have always been very good researchers and also very good instructors, which is atypical. Now, we started the Department of Psychology exclusively as a teaching department, and some of us were doing research. I think I was the 14th member, 12th member, I don't remember, something like that. I came in 1981, which we were still in King Hall. And then subsequently we built the building that was roughly across the street, across Chancellor's Walk from the business school. And there were 4 social science departments: sociology, philosophy, and anthropology, and political science, excuse me. And we were one corner of that. They gave us 8 offices, because that's at that point when the building was designed, which by the time we got there, we were way past that. And a few years ago, we were fortunate enough to get what I consider as a Taj Mahal, this beautiful building that we're part of, which contains many labs and offices. We've grown. We now have over 35 members of the department, and I think about 20 part-time faculty. So it's, between part-time and full-time, we're talking about a really large department. Compared to other schools like Chapel Hill, University of Georgia, where I got my degree, we have a very, very large department, probably one of the bigger ones. And that's partially because we grew as the university grew, and that's how a university grows and a department grows, they grow together. In other words, as we added students, we needed more faculty and onward and upward. Back in the early 1990s, we found ourselves kind of pressed, I'll say that, to begin thinking about a master's program. Because we were really a good teaching undergraduate school. We did research, but again, we focused on teaching. And then off we went to the races. It was primarily a focus on substance abuse, but not exclusively. And then little by little, we added another program, a behavior analysis, and then a general psychology program also was part of all of that. And we ended up with 3 basically parallel tracks. Not long ago, we added, I think 2 years ago, a PhD program primarily on heavy substance abuse / heavy mental illness, problems of dementia, things of that nature, sort of the more seriously mentally ill And then we're moving forward, I believe this coming year, with a PhD in psychological science. In addition to that, we have a very strong focus also on behavior analysis, and that will probably be a separate program in the very near future. We'll see. We're working on how to make that happen. So what we are is on the move. In essence, we continue growing. So we have a very strong several hundred undergraduate majors. I don't remember how many master's program enrollees we have, but we have them in 3 different areas. And in addition to that, of course, we have the emerging PhD program that's starting to look very promising, and we're applying for APA accreditation. You know, just like I told you about APA, there are different kinds of psychologists or psychology. We have different kinds of psychologists. So, for example, some of our more seasoned veterans, like Dr. Overman, he's a physiological psychologist, a biopsychologist who's interested in cognitive development. And then we got Dr. Jackson, who's a social psychologist. Then we have, for example, Dr. Galizio, who is applied behavior analysis, but more of an experimental psychopharmacologist. So those are some of the different kinds of seasoned, more mature folks. And then we got, oh boy, some of the great new faculty members. It's amazing what the folks that we have. We have neuroscientists, Dr. Coleman, gee whiz, I don't know how, there's so many really, really good people, and you sort of wonder, wow, where are we headed? Well, I think we're going to have all kinds of areas. I think we're the behavior analysis I mentioned is strong. Anything involving neuro is strong. We have a very good set of folks that do experimental. We have strong social psychologists. We have developmental psychologists. So I think it's fair to say, just like APA, that we represent many, many different kinds of psychology, but we tend to have one voice of psychology. Now, here's a question you might want to ask. What are we going to be wanting to be known as? I think it's fair to say that most of us believe that we are a heavy teaching institution, and we believe that we're going to continue emphasizing that. So psychology at the undergraduate level will continue being central to our mission. But we're also becoming research intensive. In fact, we just became a research intensive university at the level 2, which means that we're hiring people with big labs. The 2 newest hires, folks that come with grant money and a lot of great ideas. We're hanging our hopes that they will bring us fame and fortune as we move forward in the science of psychology as well. So we're trying to make sure that we maintain our focus as a teaching institution, and we emphasize the research component. But at this particular juncture, even though we sort of have several areas that we want to emphasize, we continue being a unified voice, just like APA is a unified voice. Now, let me end this presentation today in asking the question, whether it's APA, whether it's the National Academy of Neuropsychology, and North Carolina Psych Association, and Department of Psychology at UCW, what's common? What's common to all of us? In other words, we're all shouting into this megaphone. What comes out of that megaphone? What is it that, in many ways, that I'm trying to do with the new vision of APA under APA Psychological Services? How do we have this common theme? What is the common theme? I've said it before, and I'll say it again today and many other times, that psychology is a science. That's central. That is important. We are a methodology. We will never stray away from that. This is basically who we are. I think the other thing, I think it's fair to say, that we're curious, we're interested in understanding the human condition, and for that matter, just condition in general. Anything about behavior and mind, this is what we're all about. But we're also here to understand and improve the human condition. So we are the science of behavior, as I said about Skinner, we are, in addition to that, curious in so many different ways. Like I said, 50 plus different approaches to psychology, but all for the betterment of the human condition. That is what unifies what psychology is. Whether it's the Department of Psychology, whether it's APA, that's what binds us together, and that's what moves us forward as a unified vision of how do we make our world a better place. All right, so start thinking about your papers. Turn in your proposals next week, next Tuesday. It's all about 2 parts. Part 1 is very simple. 1 paragraph, what is it that you want to do? And part 2, what is it that you want to do? Specifically, what is it that you want to do to answer the question in paragraph 1? So thank you. I'll be in Orlando at the National Rehabilitation Psychology Conference, introducing the codes that we've been working on for a handful of years of how we diagnose psychological and neuropsychological disorders. So look forward to seeing you on Tuesday. Drop me an email if you have questions. Bye-bye.